Could one man, not a weapon, stop the march of an entire Ottoman army? A chilling look at how Vlad the Impaler halted an empire with pure terror. The history books often forget that a single ruler named Vlad brought an entire invading force to its knees. History's greatest warning wasn't written on stone, but carved into the flesh of 20,000 condemned souls. You won't believe the calculated suffering Vlad III used to achieve total control. The secret to Vlad's lasting power was not his military, but the grotesque spectacle of his rule. You could smell the prince's law before you ever saw the city gates, and that horrifying odor meant order. Discover the sensory shock of entering Vlad's domain. This is the forgotten history of how absolute fear became the most effective form of governance. Imagine a fear so complete it turns an entire invading army to flight. That fear was a monarch named Vlad, and his brutal method of governance became his shield. We reveal the psychology behind the Impaler's reign and how his terror saved his kingdom. The peace in Wallachia was bought with the most profound, calculated suffering Europe had ever witnessed. This is the true cost of security under Vlad the Impaler. What was the ultimate price for order in medieval Eastern Europe? The Danube frontier was an unforgiving landscape, a place where empires clashed and loyalties were always provisional. And in 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, advanced with the full confidence of Islamic dominion. But the Sultan expected resistance, fortifications, and pitched battle. Instead, as the sun began its brutal descent, illuminating the approach to Targovishte, they met a silence more terrible than any battle cry. The air itself seemed heavy, not with humidity, but with a horrifying presence that defied natural law. As the light caught the geometry of thousands upon thousands of vertical stakes, arranged with an almost aesthetic precision, each bearing a human figure. This was not chaos. This was the terrifying architecture of Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the weapon he perfected. The tapes and the single man who stopped an entire Ottoman army proved that fear was the most powerful defense. Imagine, if you will, being part of that hardened vanguard. You have seen conflict, blood, and the inevitable collapse of kingdoms. Yet as you crest the rise, the scale of the horror below forces you to halt your horse. This spectacle transcends mere military atrocity. It is a calculated performance of absolute, unyielding control, and the bodies twisted and broken by slow agony are not randomly scattered, as soldiers are grouped here. Boyars who betrayed him stand there, and whole families are sometimes arranged. By the nature of their transgression, what came next changed everything. This forest of death, numbering some say 20,000, was more than a deterrent. It was a psychological wall, an unbreachable lesson in obedience etched onto the horizon, proving how history's greatest warning was carved into the flesh of 20,000 souls. Vlad's obsession was not with swift death, but with maximizing the duration of the suffering, transforming pain into an ongoing public lecture. And the technique of impalement itself was refined to serve this terrifying purpose. Unlike a sharp spike designed for quick penetration, Vlad's stakes were often deliberately blunted and oiled. This ensured the body's weight would cause a protracted, agonizing descent, sometimes lasting for hours, even days. The stake was carefully positioned to avoid vital organs, preserving life long enough for the spectacle to fully unfold. And this methodical cruelty elevated a common form of execution into a theatrical, systemic purge, turning the very act of dying into a civic duty observed by the terrified populace. A method so refined you could smell the prince's law before you ever saw the city gates. You must understand the cold logic behind this horror. For Vlad, the price of instability, of petty theft, of noble plotting, of foreign incursion was intolerable, and his use of impalement was transactional. The life of the condemned was exchanged for the collective security of the realm. Consider the famous tale of the honest merchant. Vlad tests his honesty after impaling a thief, placing a gold purse in the public square. When the merchant returns the exact change, Vlad rewards him. Yet the stakes lining the road serve as the true measure of order. The quiet tension in Wallachia was derived from the knowledge that absolute safety came at the price of absolute submission. But this wasn't the end, and this shows how Vlad engineered a fear so complete it could turn an entire invading army to flight. Vlad's methods extended far beyond the stake, utilizing the most ancient human fears: fire, water, and exposure. And the public execution became a multifaceted theater of control, often incorporating the terrifying sight of boiling alive. Picture the square, not celebrating a feast, but hushed by the presence of a vast cauldron, stoked beneath with firewood reserved in other lands for poisoners. Vlad used this horrific method to condemn bandits and serious rebels. Whether filled with water, oil, or even animal fat, the spectacle was designed to imprint itself permanently on the collective memory. As the peace in Wallachia was bought with profound, calculated suffering, your imagination does more work than any chronicler's scroll. The actual number of those boiled may be debated by historians, yet the existence of the cauldron, the ritual stacking of the wood, and the acrid smell of the preparation were enough to secure obedience. The true power was in the rumor, the whispered possibility that your failure to follow the prince's harsh edicts could lead to such a dreadful dissolving end. And the community was not allowed to forget. Every puff of dark smoke from the square was a reminder that Vlad's justice was liquid, engulfing, and final. The Saxon communities of Transylvania, strategically crucial but often hostile to Wallachian control, felt the prince's wrath keenly. Through the use of mass burning, in 1457 the suburbs of Brasov were not caught in a siege. They were deliberately consumed by an inferno ordered by Vlad. Fire became the ultimate tool of erasure. Imagine the crackle of burning timber, the screams swallowed by the roar, and the sight of neighboring houses catching the contagion of destruction. This was not collateral damage. It was focused, targeted annihilation, intended to send an unequivocal message across ethnic and political lines. You witnessed the aftermath: ash and silence, where vibrant marketplaces stood just days before. And the scorched earth policy served as a warning, more effective than any standing army. We must consider the German chronicler accounts, which speak of a gruesome banquet, where hundreds of sick and poor were gathered, fed, and then sealed within a hall that was subsequently put to the torch. Whether factual or legend, the belief in such an act demonstrates the scale of the fear Vlad cultivated. To survive under such a rule meant living in a constant state of calculated apprehension, knowing that the ruler's decree could turn your hearth into your pyre. When fire was too fast, Vlad employed methods of slow, deliberate agony that extended the act of condemnation. Roasting over coals was reserved for spies and those who had committed the most profound betrayals. The setting was low, the fire built just enough to ensure agonizing heat without rapid death. The victim, often tied to a metal spit or grid, faced a slow consumption. Picture the shadows cast by the flickering flames illuminating the faces of the condemned and the cold detachment of the executioners. You might wonder how any ruler could maintain his sanity while supervising such horror. The Ottoman chronicles, often reliable in their descriptions of their enemy, describe Vlad dining calmly near the roasting victims. The act of eating while others suffered served as the ultimate demonstration of his indifference, an assertion that the natural order, as he defined it, was more important than individual life. What came next changed everything for those who believed death was the worst fate. If the body was the canvas of his justice, then mutilation was the final, devastating flourish. Skinning alive was a punishment designed not just for pain, but for ultimate humiliation, turning the condemned into a raw, bloody symbol of defiance, punished, the reports from local and foreign observers. In the 1450s describe a slow, meticulous process, often beginning at the torso or limbs, ensuring the victim experienced the stripping away of their identity for minutes or hours. Imagine the chilling sight of flayed, bloody skin hung upon the city gates, a biological banner proclaiming the prince's law. The victim's body, the most personal of possessions, was transformed into an architectural ornament. For corrupt officials or captured enemy soldiers, this spectacle served a dual function. It exacted the ultimate penalty and ensured that the warning was visible from a distance long before travelers even reached the gates. The message was inescapable. In Wallachia, you could literally lose your skin for crossing the line. Dismemberment provided Vlad a public means of reducing influential figures to pieces, a brutal visual metaphor for the dissolution of their power. This was not a quick mercy. Traitorous boyars caught plotting might lose their right hand in the public square, a physical mark of their treachery. The remains were sometimes sent to the victim's family, a final sickening act of psychological warfare that extended the punishment beyond the grave. This meticulous fragmentation ensured that memory of the crime was etched onto the stumps and scars of the survivors. How do you erase a man without taking his life? Vlad understood that identity resides in the face and facial mutilation. The slicing of the nose, the removal of lips, the blinding, was a lifelong sentence of inescapable shame. You could survive the punishment, but every time you walked the street, your ruined face would be a living monument to the prince's authority. And this was a fate worse than death for many, transforming the victim into a permanent pariah, a living advertisement of the state's absolute power. The most personal and profound violation was reserved for moral or sexual crimes. Genital mutilation, frequently documented in the 1460s, was Vlad's final statement on the concept of lineage and succession, used against men accused of sexual violence or adultery and sometimes against women. This was a penalty that ensured the end of the bloodline, eliminating the possibility of heirs. And the chilling effect of this punishment struck at the core of feudal society where family honor was everything. Think of the spies, the rivals, and the false messengers who suffered under the sensory mutilations. Losing your hand is a handicap, losing your eyes or your tongue is the destruction of communication, autonomy, and knowledge. Blinding by hot iron, or the slicing out of the tongue for lying, turned the victim into a mute, stumbling witness to their own demise. But this wasn't the end. Even the simplest punishment delivered publicly carried Vlad's unique signature. Even the ubiquitous act of hanging was reframed by Vlad. He used the gallows not for a quick end, but as a public fixture, lining roads with dangling corpses to maximize visibility. In Brasov, after a purge, hundreds were said to have been executed in a single day, their bodies left swaying, drawing the attention of birds and beasts. The speed of the execution mattered less than the duration of the display, turning the landscape into a vast, silent graveyard that stretched for miles. You are a soldier forced to pierce a captured traitor not with a simple blade, but with an iron spike, mirroring the slow, deliberate nature of the impalement. Vlad used stabbing and piercing as communal acts of condemnation, forcing his own men to participate in the agony, thereby implicating everyone in his violent regime. The metal stake, when used instead of wood, combined the swiftness of the blade with the lasting dread of the tapes. Where impalement was complex, suspension on hooks was brutally efficient. Bodies were strung up from city gates and fortress walls, the iron hooks driven through the flesh, leaving victims to hang semi-conscious in plain view. These durable, reusable hooks ensured the warnings remained long after the victim succumbed to gravity and exposure. And this was the ultimate urban deterrent, visible and undeniable. When facing a rival noble or captured commander, Vlad employed public decapitation, a brutal final assertion of authority. You see the sword fall, hear the thud, and witness the immediate installation of the severed head on a spike above the city. This trophy, sometimes arranged alongside others by rank, marked the territory, and the silence that followed the swing of the blade was perhaps the loudest proclamation of the prince's unassailable power. Fear was not only about death, it was about labor. After crushing a rebellious faction, Vlad sentenced the surviving nobles not to death, but to endless punishing work. The rebuilding of Panari Fortress, stone by stone, under the constant threat of the whip and the stake, transformed Walachia's geography with the blood and sweat of its dissenters. The fortresses and roads became physical reminders that even survival meant perpetual servitude. Sometimes the prince needed no fire or steel. Captives were stripped and left bound to posts, abandoned to the brutal extremes of the Wallachian environment. You see the victims succumbing to the cold of winter or the dehydration of summer. Nature became the passive executioner, reinforcing the belief that the land itself had turned against the prince's enemies. The collective massacre was the final, devastating answer to rebellion.
When a Saxon village was suspected of aiding his enemies, Vlad's response was total erasure. Entire communities, men, women, and children, were purged, and their homes burned, and the records listing the thousands killed served as a chilling formal proof of concept. Disobedience resulted in the instantaneous removal of the entire societal unit. Consider the deep reach of his law into private life. Moral crimes, particularly adultery, were met with public shame, followed by unimaginable violations like impalement through the genitals. You are forced to witness the punishment, understanding that no corner of your existence, not even the sanctity of your marriage, was beyond the prince's jurisdiction. When answers were demanded, the torture chamber provided them. Vlad employed whips, hot irons, and psychological manipulation, often forcing one suspect to watch the agonizing suffering of another. The aim was not just pain, but the complete breaking of will, ensuring that confessions, whether true or coerced, were extracted swiftly, reinforcing the belief that resistance was utterly
futile. Even in the quiet hours, the memory persists. You see the severed heads mounted on spikes above the city gates, their silent, rotting faces, the final, lasting testament to Vlad's rule. Hands and limbs hang from market stalls and fortress doors, turning public spaces into perpetual exhibits of state-sanctioned terror. Every piece of visible human remains reaffirms the same terrifying truth. The prince's reach extends beyond death. Vlad III, known as the Impaler, created a legacy of calculated cruelty that became a shield against the most powerful empire of his age. His reign was built on the premise that order, when enforced with absolute, unforgettable violence, transcends mere law and becomes a force of nature. Wallachhia's peace was cold, brutal, and conditional, sustained by the permanent shadow of the stakes. The memory of his deeds did not die with him. It entered the bloodstream of European folklore, a dark truth whispered across continents. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. The shadows of the past never truly dissipate. They merely shift their focus. The history of power is the history of what humanity is willing to sacrifice for stability. As we conclude this chapter, the unsettling question remains: was the order Vlad imposed worth the human cost of its terrifying foundation? If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter. Walk further into history's shadows with us.